on just on timing, so I'll indicate timestamps for 1, 6, and 7 in the chat, but please time yourselves as well. Without further ado, Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes.
Give me a moment to set my timer. I prefer verbal POIs. I won't be looking at the chat at all. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I used to be in a relationship where there wasn't any romantic relations, right? There wasn't any romance. It was fully platonic. But the people around me subjected to me to push me into following into a romantic relationship whereby I was subjected to being in an organic relationship whereby I had to be subjected to the norms of society in order to be in a relationship that was the norm of the society, right? We think that this is extremely problematic on side opening government. But firstly, let's set up the debate on our side, right? Firstly, what do we think that relationships are defined to be like, right? Relationships are defined based on the level of intimacy, which is the emotional connection, commitment, romance, and sexual connection, right? This looks like romantic relationships connected through intimacy and romance. And in a lot of cases, the byproduct is a high level of commitment and sexual connection. This looks like having romantic partners and marriage. But B, it looks like relationships without romance could be based on intimacy, sexual connection, or commitment. This looks like friendship, platonic relationships, co-parenting, benefit, or friends with benefits. This is how we think relationships could also be defined to be like, right? But the second piece of setup then is, what does the manifestation of the social emphasis look like? It looks like A, pressuring people into getting romantic relationships, i.e. through religion and culture. When telling people that they need to get married and reproduce immediately because they need to follow their culture and religion, which says that there's no sex before marriage, there's no dating before marriage, etc. But B, shaping what is considered as the correct version of romantic relationship, i.e. there are standards and expectations that must be fulfilled, such as how many children you need to have and how long should you date before marrying, as seen in media, where the perfect couple exists when there's a strong love connection between the couple in itself, what media portrays in romantic comedies or romantic movies, right? But C, the deprioritization and stigmatization of other forms of relationships, i.e. people who do not get into romantic relationships are looked down upon in society, whereby they are needed to be in a romantic relationships when they have a significant other who is deemed to be their partner, right? And the third piece is set up. We are only regarding the emphasis on romantic relationships, not the form of relationship itself. We prefer a world where there's not specific emphasis on which form of relationship a person should get into. This looks like A, they can be in any form of relationship they want. Like I said, the co-parenting, the platonic relationship, the friends with benefits. But B, in the super rare cases, people don't want any form of relationship. We still think it's better than being pushed into forming a romantic relationship like society wants, right? And then moving on to my arguments on the emphasis of romantic relationships, which excludes people from obtaining happiness in itself for people on the ground. But before that, are there any POIs? 3, 2, 1. So the first level analysis to explain this is that the emphasis on romantic relationships excludes people from attaining happiness. This looks like A, it creates an unrealistic version of what relationships should be. It looks like number 1, many individuals who are incapable, and this looks like number 1, people who cannot attain this unrealistic version are individuals who are incapable of showing love. And secondly, individuals who have childhood trauma because parents never express love to them, or they have faced abuse when they were a child, and they have an avoidant attachment styles. These are the people who cannot attain that unrealistic version of what relationships should be. But thirdly, it also affects people who are poor as well, because they cannot do romantic expressions such as candlelit dinners or getting roses on Valentine's, or even giving present to their significant other because they are in a poor situation. These are the people who cannot go through that unrealistic version of what relationships could be that the media or even people around them in society portray it to be. But B, B, the second level analysis, is that people like these will be subjugated to standards by society. This is like number one. If a person doesn't subscribe to this relationship, you would be someone who is not a good partner. You would be immediately vilified by society, labeling that person as a bad partner to their own significant other, when in itself it is only an unrealistic version that has been subjected by society to the people on in this relationship. What are the harms then? It looks like number one, it's difficult to obtain happiness for these people because they will be labeled as like unlovable and not a good partner. The second harm then is that these people who cannot obtain the unrealistic version will self-internalize because they do not have the ability to express the love to their partner like the unrealistic version states. But thirdly, if in a toxic relationship, let's say in a toxic relationship, it's harder for these individuals to opt out of the relationship because of the narrative that is put on them. Because of that narrative, it's harder, they are staying in that toxic relationship, not getting out because they will be scared by the subjugating of society in itself. But the fourth harm, all of these harms lead to them giving up in itself of attaining a healthy relationship with their significant other because of the unrealistic standards that come up to them, right? So the impact to this is number one, it will lock individuals out from engaging in meaningful relationships, which is bad because relationships are supposed to be like universal, right? It doesn't matter whether or not the idea of a relationship should be, it should be in any form in itself, right? So what are the kinds of relationships that are now deemed as acceptable absence of this emphasis? The framing here is individuals are now allowed to choose what relationships that they want, i.e. number one, hookup cultures, or number two, open relationships, or number three, friends with benefits, or number four, co-parenting, or even platonic relationships and romantic relationship in itself. People are free to choose whatever types of relationships that they want. And people deserve to choose what kind of relationships they want because number one, relationship is personal to them and only to them in itself. And number two, how they get fulfillment in a relationship should be based on their standards and not societal standards, right? So then, why is allowing them to choose good? Because number one, they can love at their own pace. They can love at their own pace, meaning to say they do not need to rush into things, into being in a romantic relationship, right? They can navigate through that relationship. And the relationship is contingent on how that person is throughout the relationship. It isn't like putting on the society's narratives or social norms or media perception through their relationship, which allows them to go at a slow pace without a love bombing situation, right? Whereby they're loving towards each other for like a few months and immediately break it off at the end of the day after they do not feel anything, right? The second thing is they can also set on their own standards, right? And this is good because you get much more meaningful relationships because it's tailored to yourself. And meaningful relationships is important because at the end of the day, this is your own relationship. You should have a meaningful relationship with your own partner. And secondly, the comparative here is the moment you deviate romantic relationships, which is preferred by these relationships, automatically makes you look like on opposition side. It automatically makes you look like you're a bad partner the moment you deviate from that narrative of a romantic relationship. Without never been proud to propose, go with side opening.
Thanks, Speaker, for that speech. I invite the Leader of Opposition to begin the case for opening opposition.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
All right, give me a moment. All right, I have no preferred gender pronouns. I will take POIs verbally because I'm not going to look at the chat. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, I think that the side of Open government has severely downplayed the other alternatives that would be emphasized in status quo if you don't emphasize on romantic relationships. In this speech, I'll do a few things. The first is I would like to provide a few responses towards the speaker before me, but secondly, I'll answer 3 questions in my speech. The first, why do we prefer romantic relationships in general? Secondly, I'll argue to you, why does the social emphasis on these romantic relationships diversify what it means to be, what is romance and what it means to be romantic? But lastly, I'll answer the question, why the emphasis of social relationships have helped in creating much more healthier relationships, thus dealing with OG's case. Firstly, a few responses. Number 1, I think that opening government's entire case is contingent upon this line of analysis, which says, oh, you know what? Because of the emphasis of social relationships, people are forced into these relationships, i.e. by culture, i.e. by religion, i.e. by peers. But recognize, Mr. Speaker, absent of this narrative, understand that these relationships would also exist regardless. That means the forced marriages that happen within India would still happen as well. The crucial thing here is that because of the existence of this narrative, this is the point in which that society can use this narrative to pinpoint it out that, you know what, this person is being coerced and forced into this relationship. This is not romance. This is not love. I think that because of this, you reduce the awareness that there is, and you reduce the positive amount of discourse that could happen because of that could happen in order to oppose these abusive relationships at the end of the day. All right, now I'm going to answer the 3 questions within my speech. Firstly, why do we prefer these romantic relationships in general, right? Number 1, we think that understanding, because there is a constant pursuit of you wanting to find the best partner, right? Therefore, you're going to be more aware of what you want as an individual. What are the likely scenarios that opening government did not want to defend today? Number 1, the likely scenarios looks like things like hookup culture, looks like friends with benefits. These are short-term relationships in general, which are not as fulfilling, and I'm going to prove to you why. Because recognize here, the reason is why they're not as fulfilling because they go against, like, in general, what the human nature craves, right? I think that because you can see this, it's much more obvious when you look at trends and stories of people regretting the point in which that they never settled down, the point in which whereby they never chose to pursue love in the first place. But the reason as to why that these relationships are highly valued in society in general is because there is a long-term happiness here, right? Let's recognize that you're going to be involved with this individual for a much longer time. You're going to grow with them. Therefore, the existence of this narrative allows individuals to know to actually give a damn about what they actually want from a particular relationship. Second question here: why does the social emphasis on romantic relationships diversify what it means to be a romance? Recognize that the problem that OG highlights is this: that there is an over-glorification of things such as fancy dinners, such as roses, all of these high standard things that exist in order for you to fulfill the requirement of romance. But recognize here, the reason as to why these things exist is because there is a lack of emphasis on romance in the first place. How does this narrative diversify the meaning of romance? The point in which there is a social emphasis on romance in particular, there will naturally be an incentive to make romance much more accessible. What does this look like? It looks like means that individuals will have an incentive to find romantic value in other things. It looks like these simple things, such as cooking for them, such as providing them with even small gifts and small gestures, which are things that are much more accessible, right? When you don't emphasize like the romantic aspect of a relationship, the emphasis then sways towards things that are much more inaccessible, and this is why we think that this narrative is something that is beneficial. Sure, we understand that there might also be an overemphasis on these small things, like for example, if your partner doesn't do this and you see like your friend's partner cook for them. But I think that this is something that is fair for individuals to want for themselves, and I think this is something that is justified. But recognize here that even in the instance where you cannot access these things, I think that the pursuit of this is something that is rewarding in itself, because you realize that you know what, you don't need a lot to be happy. You don't need like big grand scale things to be counted as romance. Before 6, any of your eyes from CG? OG?
Yes. You say it's all about small gestures. Unfortunately, the romanticization in media is about buying big things. It's about big expressions of love and sharing it on social media. I think there's a tension here.
Yes, correct. But the reason as to why those things in media, those things in society become much more rampant is because you don't emphasize the concept of romance, and people don't actually have an incentive to take it apart and diversify the meaning romance. Okay, so, all right. Now the last question I answered in this speech. What is the emphasis of social relationships help in how does it help in creating much more healthier relationships? A few things. Number one, because recognize before there is an emphasis, right? There is a trend of convenience that partners would often have towards each other, i.e. like male partners treating their female counterparts much more horribly. There's a lack of investment from one partner to another. The point in which you emphasize on the romance part of a relationship, that's when you create awareness and incentive for partners to take care of each other even more. Because now, once you shift it towards, as I explained you just now, when you shift the focus towards romance, and the romance becomes much more diversified, partners are more inclined to focus on the other small things that their partners should do. So in instances whereby they don't do it and they mistreat you, therefore you will stand up for yourself. For all those reasons, oppose. Thank you.
Thanks, Speaker, for that speech. I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case from opening government.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll be taking POIs from closing for engagement, but if they don't have any, I'll gladly take one from opening. Just give me a second. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Many mothers face abusive relationships because they can't opt out of it. And the reason why they can't leave the relationship is because if they were to be perceived to be leaving the husband, then the women itself are going to be perceived as the one who doesn't love the husband enough, although the husband has sacrificed so much of stuff towards his women. And this kind of narrative is corrosive because it is imbued within their brains to think that whatever happens, whatever abuse that I go through, I'm forced to stay in this relationship because it is a romantic one. And if I opt out of it, then no one will want me again. And no one will ever want to approach me again because I'm seen as unlovable, and I'm seen as the one that's breaking out of the barriers that exist right now. This is the corrosive nature of what opening opposition and both closing opposition want to defend under their side of the house. The problem with romantic relationship itself is not entitled to this debate. Camilla made it clear that the emphasis on the only way for you to get the best form of relationship is for you to go through romantic relationships. We say that romantic relationships is one that is personal, that is tied to you and only you, and you should be the one to have the power to decide what is a form of relationship that is good for you. Notice how opening opposition just disregard the fact that the emphasis does all of those things that is mentioned in Camilla's speech, but they just mitigate it by saying, well, at the end of the day, we're still going to have romantic relationships. Yeah, we prefer people to have romantic relationships if they want to do so in the first place. If they don't want to have any romantic relationships, if they are regretting the fact that they are in a romantic relationship, then they can opt out of it and go to any other forms of relationship that exist under outside of the house. This is the one sole benefit that opening opposition and both closing opposition cannot opt into their speech. They have to defend a world where the nature of this emphasis itself is coercing individuals to opt into it in the first place. Which is why, panel, I'm pretty sure everyone in this room, except for Umar, probably have been faced with this one question from our aunties on when are you going to get married. This is a kind of question that is basically just in a way toxic in nature, because some of us just don't want to get married, but some of us do. But at the point of which, when you give this power towards this towards society to think that you are supposed to be in love, this is where all the harms manifest. Two things I'll do in my speech panel. Number one, I'll just deal with the case coming from opening opposition. And number two, I'll just do in weighing to extend on the case from Camilla. And I'll give you our third argument on why now when you have the option to opt into what kind of relationship that you want, it becomes a low barrier of entry for single mothers to opt into a relationship that is meaningful for them. And this is just independent of the argument that came from Camilla, but can still co-opt the same benefits. Let's take a look at the case coming from opening opposition in the first instance. They first said that, well, when you don't have this narrative, then it cuts out the awareness to actually stop forced marriages in the first place. Number one, I don't see any logical link as to how when you have romantic relationships, it basically stops forced marriages from happening. Forced marriages will still happen regardless because of number one, cultural ties, because of number two, probably because they treat most of the time, like women as commodities in order for their family to actually survive another day. They use these women as commodities in order for them to get benefits in return. But also thirdly, even if in the best case scenario, what is true that the emphasis itself is the one that causes like such forced marriages to happen in the first place, forced marriages to happen in the first place, at least when we reduce or when we remove this emphasis altogether, it becomes one less reason why forced marriages are going to happen at the end of the day. The second thing, or at least the biggest case coming from the side of opening opposition, is that when it comes to just diversifying like romance is good because you get to reinterpret what a romantic relationship would look like. The example that was given by Hasbul in his speech was to talk about how, well, now poor people don't have to, break their bank accounts because now they can look for little meanings of like enjoyment in life that seem to be romantic. Number one, I think what Ram said in his POI was correct, that media portrayal is one that is corrosive. But to add on even further, I think the portrayal of media looks as such, right? It's, for example, you portray a couple like probably Justin Bieber and Hailey Bieber to be, receiving like the best of flowers or living like the best of homes and having the best of gifts. The fact that you see this is visually the perfect form of like relationship means that even in the small instance, it's going to trigger people to also break their bank accounts and influence them to actually, spend lavish lives towards these individuals when it comes to obtaining romantic relationships. This is a problem that exists more on the side of opposition because it makes relationships more materialistic to the point where it's inaccessible for people who are poor. But number two, Camilla gave not just like individuals who are affected just towards poor people. We also talk about individuals who aren't able to basically express love. These are the kind of individuals who probably grew up not knowing what love looks like because they can't see it in their parents, but when they grow up they are being vilified because they don't know how to express love, while this whole time these individuals are just lost in just trying to self-discover what love actually looks like. But it's precisely because this emphasis is one that is toxic, it forces these individuals to immediately show love in a romantic relationship. At the point when you don't do it, then you're considered to be unlovable at the end of the day. Before I move on, are there any POIs from closing?
If relationships are transactional on our side based on wealth or whatever, then how can people receive no reciprocity in their relationship and still stay in it?
Yeah, but probably those are the kind of individuals who are benefiting from those kind of relationships at the end of the day. What I'm like suggesting to you here is that individuals who benefit from this emphasis, it's fine because they're okay with it. But the majority of people who can't reciprocate with the same form of relationships that exist right now are the ones that are being vilified at the end of the day. Sure, you can have a person who is like, just platonic in nature, don't know how to express love, but buy gifts for like the other partner. But it doesn't mean it's enjoyable for that other person because that person probably doesn't know what's going on and that person is still going to be labeled as unlovable at the end of the day. And like, the conclusion to the case of opposition is one is simple panel. Not only did not deal with the majority of instances where this emphasis is one that is corrosive, but number two, they mitigate it by saying that how that diversification of romance is just enough when we've proven to you already it's not enough. Let's take a look at the weighing and in terms of why we edge over both closing opposition and opening opposition. In terms of just accessibility to attain happiness, we base on two metrics. Number one, in terms of flexibility. It's precisely because now individuals are being given the autonomy to pick and choose what kind of relationship fit them. This means that we have more flexibility for these individuals to self-discover themselves before they commit to a relationship that they actually want. And secondly, we also have an opt-in and opt-out mechanism because we allow individuals to see whether or not a relationship is suitable for them. This means that they would never ever be trapped in a relationship where the emphasis of romantic relationship would basically tell them to just stay in these relationships in order for them to just save face within like the face of society. Argument on why now there is a low barrier for entry for single mothers. I think the narrative exists right now, panels, that in order for you as a single mother to basically have a good relationship, you have to love a partner. Obviously, this is because it basically is going to affect your child. If you don't love your partner, then your child is going to see it and it's going to be hard for your child to grow up at the end of the day. Right now, when you remove this form of like emphasis in general, it gives more leeway for just single mothers who actually have a relationship with like another person for the purposes of just like co-parenting, for example, that they can actually be beneficial not only for the single mother but also for the child. Thank you.
Thanks, Speaker, for that speech. I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the debate from the opening half.
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. If there's any echo or stuttering, please let me know. So my internet is quite bad. Okay, I'll take a POI, preferably from closing at the 5th minute. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. OG cannot win this debate due to the dismissal characterization of what is actually happening in today's society, where things are more progressive, where discourse always happen, and where the dynamics of relationships will always change. I will give a comprehensive account why progressive discourse that happens on social media and other forms of media today change how romantic relationships are, and they will get better, not based on the characterization of what OG says, which is a thing of the past. How will my speech go? Firstly, I'll just rebut what happened in OG, and lastly, I will give my own additional extension on why the emphasis of social progressiveness and discourse today helps relationship get better, and why we still prefer romantic relationships over other forms of relationships as opposed to what opening government is saying. Then I'll give a comprehensive weighing on why, based on the framing that we provided, we'll take this debate. Firstly, what did opening government says? Opening government gives a few characterizations that really don't fit in today's society. What did they mention? They mentioned things like, being forced to marry someone, which is forced marriage, how these people are forced by society into doing something that they don't want to do. This is coercion, and pretty sure this is illegal. And even if they are forced to do it, there are methods to get out of it simply by you can just not opt into your parents forced marrying you, or like people forcing you to get along with your best friend. You can just say no. I fail to see how this is a big impact on a larger scale. Secondly, on the problem of the emphasis on relationships and how you have to serve a certain set template, right? I'll mention later why templates don't work anymore in current society, but I like to draw the distinction between romantic relationships and material relationships, right? What opening government and to an extent closing government is trying to say that the more cars you buy for your wife, the more flowers, the more bigger dates means greater relationship. While that used to be true, more people are becoming more and more aware that you don't need these kinds of things. You can do the little things that makes your partner happy, regardless of whatever they want, whether you want them to bring you out on a date every so often, whether you just want them to text the whole day, or providing as much as you can provide no matter how poor you are. So saying that, people who are poor in our world still get to be in relationships, simply because a poor person, if he cannot attain and maintains a really high maintenance wife, they wouldn't get that wife anyway. They would avoid the problem completely and accept someone who loves them from who they are. This is simply what is happening in current status, happened in opening opposition. Secondly, they say that there are unrealistic dating standards, but I also like to posit that on the discourse on media today, more people are calling out all these unrealistic standards. You see people saying why you don't need to be realistic, why you must not have a template for your partner, and why you should always take time for yourself and fully commit to certain relationships that take a lot of your time, simply because there's long-term payment and commitment in the future instead of frivolous relationships. And even if you opt to be alone, why this romantic narrative is something that is beneficial to you, because at least you know the society's perspective on what you should do should you want to ever find a romantic relationship. Now, after that, they mentioned how this weird case about how abusive mothers cannot leave relationships because they're perceived as bad wives. This will be more harmful on their side, assuming that this mother is in a proper relationship. If this mother, so as they say, is entered into a friends with benefits relationship, or worse yet, a promiscuous relationship, they would face more backlash on government's word much later, simply because now they get to dictate what they want, and that may not conform to society. At least with the proper view or narrative on what we have as a romantic relationship, at least they exist on what is and what is not tolerable in society, right? Like it or not, we cannot do exactly what we want without backlash, especially when it comes to things that involves the lives of others, right? So before I move on, yes, I'll take a PI from OG.
Yeah, you just considered that you want to drop standards. If this relationship is so personal to them, why should they ever do that?
Yeah, dropping standards isn't exclusive on your side. It can happen on both sides, but I'll show later why the discourse changes how this happens. Lastly, to tackle why there is actually low barrier for for single mothers or in fact any other people within government's world, simply because there is no proper metric or there's no proper relationship. Everyone could be what they want. Everyone could decide what they want to be, right? Things would be more chaotic. This looks like more people having friends with benefits without knowing their consequences. This looks like people having open relationships when their partner does not consent to it. This looks like people, cheating on your wife with the concept that she's not too pretty for you, therefore you get to do what you want, and this is because what I want. This is all the kinds of sayings that would happen on government side. Now, to explain further, why will OO take this debate? Because we answer this emphasis is needed to generate discourse in the current world. Things like books, medias, movies, societal norms, YouTube story times, which all discusses on all these problems that eventually, like, progressive people will insert their voice and create awareness and call out all the toxic cultures that OG wants to say, right? Things like promiscuity will be further examined and discussed by society. Things that look like bad parenting, things like domestic abuse, things like beauty standards. They're all checked and balanced by current society, where there will be sides where we'll move to a more progressive standpoint, as what we see in liberal societies, right? But to tackle the really hard bullet, right, on what happens after all this constant pursuit, after all this sacrifice, and after all this commitment, what happens if the relationship that you've been in, that been so romantic, falls apart? We're willing to take the trade-off and say that we'll bite the bullet and we'll take it as a lesson. At least now I know who I want in the future. At least I know to not repeat all those mistakes. Now I know what are my own personal flaws and what I can improve myself for that future partner. And even if I opt to even if an opening government's work, they won't have this self-introspection, right? They will repeat mistake after mistake with your friends with benefits or who they want to choose with, because there's no set limits, right? Like, at least here, number one, we take away all the toxic standards, but maintain all the proper standards that has to be in romantic relationships. So at the end of the day, what changes, right? At least on opposition side, yes, we admit toxic standards used to exist, but with the prospect of time, things will get better. Relationships will be something that is more healthy, something that is more considerate to both sides, and there's less likelihood for abuse. And even if there is abuse, there are things that can be done by the wife now, because she has more options and she has more awareness of what to do if your husband abuses you or if your partner abuses you, right? At the end of the day, all the harms that comes from opening government are things of the past that eventually remain in the past, because things will get better. So in terms of all the stakeholders they want to protect, they still will exist on our side. We're willing to take the trade-off that the things that they want to purport are not what's best for society or should go through.
Thanks, Vicky, for that speech. I now invite the member of government to begin the closing half of the debate. Member of government.
Yeah. 1 second, am I visible and audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, 1 second. Just give me 1 second. My dog always freezes. I hate it when this happens. Okay, perfect. Okay. Starting my speech. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate should be less about mothers and sons and more about how the manifestation of this emphasis looks like with regards to how it interacts with the psyche of people, particularly on aspects of toxic media narratives and regressive cultures and superstitions that enforces sexist and homophobic sentiments. This debate also lacks the discussion on whether people can truly be better off absent of this emphasis when they are alone. CG will be extremely clear on why this emphasis harms people who are seeking for love, harms people who are in relationships, and why our counterfactual is much better for every single person out there. First, on framing, I'm going to first explain what opposing this emphasis actually looks like, because it's missing. Since the emphasis is already overarching, opposing this emphasis would look like 3 parts to a counterfactual. Number 1, it is okay to be alone. Number 2, it is okay to not find love actively and aggressively because you're not ready or you can't do this at this point in time. Number 3, I can focus on myself or other facets like friendship and family, absence of emphasis. I'll explain why all hosts of these counterfactuals are significantly better off. First extension, how the toxic media and societal depiction of love creates an insurmountable harm towards people who are seeking for love. First part of this is that it's one-dimensional. Often, media narratives oftentimes portray a certain, you need to look in a certain way, you need to be in a certain body, and the love is probably subjugated towards majoritarian standards like heterosexuality or enforces serious gender stereotypes. This impacts and sidelines minorities who are not represented. Why is this bad? Oftentimes, this also creates unreasonable expectations on how to navigate relationships. This is missing from opening government because media narratives are profit-driven, and at the end of the day, they are selling a product that is cemented by capitalism. So cinematography, script writing, plot line is always so unrealistically written to fit into what sells the best. That is why you have sappy happy endings that are not drawn to reality of how people can actually live their lives in terms of love. What this means is that the profit-driven nature of media clashes with the reality of relationships that can inherently be uninteresting, dull, can be extremely painful, and this characterization is important because it's not dependent on any certain type of media portrayal, but all media portrayal, because we always prove that profit always downplays aspects of reality that does not sell. Let's say in opening opposition's best case, where they have progression, where there's some level of liberalism and they have incorporation of that. Even then, there's aspects of heteronormity, there's aspects of queer baiting, there's aspects of queer coding. All these are just addition or tokenistic versions of incorporating minorities that are not intrinsic to the plot and don't represent the real adversities of people that are suffering. Example of this is like the show Heartstopper in Netflix. They don't have actual representation of adversities of minorities. This is important. Minorities already persecuted by the states face so much adversity of repressing their love because their identity is in and of itself not accepted by the public. This is far worse because they're not represented by toxic media narrative. Second, the one true love trope. The one true love like Disney, there's only one person out there. There's only one Munyama Parimala out there for you. Why is this really bad? The scale of this definition is not expanding. What about people who want to be non-monogamous? What about people who want a partner who is just a best friend, but you don't want romantic commitment? What if you have a partner that's amazing, but you always question if there's someone better because of this one true love? So people's response can always be different, but all their response is bad. What is a likely response? Sometimes people always don't know the line of whenever they think who is best, they don't know who is the best partner yet. They think maybe this person is not the best and always want to look out for that. And therefore, it's unrealistic expectations. You're never truly happy because its emphasis doesn't have an end line. The third part of this argument is social conventions and superstitions. I'm unclear why this is missing out in opening half. This debate doesn't really focus on media, but it's social emphasis of this particular love. If you go by way of culture and superstition, really GGWP. Culture enforces sexist and misogynistic narratives where women have to be demure, women have to be subservient to men. It is conservatism that takes the upper hand in how relationships should be deemed, and often gender minorities that are not socially expected to either fit into really restrictive roles or worse, not even being given the right to love are fucking locked out, and that's why it's significantly backed out. Why is this extension debate winning? 2 reasons. Number 1, on the magnitude of harm. We prove why the magnitude of harm of toxic, harmful imposition of media and society is really bad. Number 2, we prove that in all instances, it's extremely pressuring and difficult to find love because the expectation is placed on you. This alone already proves why it's bad. But second extension, how this harms individuals who are already in relationships. The preface to this extension is it deals with people who are already full on in this narrative and are already in relationships. So what happens when this emphasis actually takes place? You put relationship as a priority and it's weighed out as more important over other considerations. Why is this bad? 3 reasons. Number 1, you're more likely to downplay abuse or toxicity that happens in relationship because you feel relationship most important, let me just push through even when the further is a fucker. Number 2, you don't know when to stop when your partner doesn't fit your dynamic. What if the partner is actually a lame idiot, no personality, but you don't know because love is the most important thing. You're actually not happy, but it's the imposition or the attachment towards me needing love is what makes you happy, but actually you're really not, but eventually you're just going to be bogged down by all of the loneliness. Number 3, you're more likely to compromise on other important considerations like work. Like the most rational weighing metric here is if career advancement and money is able to make you happy and insulate some problems, relationship now put as an ultimatum, you're going to sacrifice all this. You're going to sacrifice your family. It's going to be there at the end of the day. So what happens is you're going to keep pushing and condoning the cycle of hurting yourself beyond repair because love is put at a priority when other things can be a priority. That's why in our world, if romance is good for you, go for it. If friends are good for you, go for it. If being alone is good for you, we don't have an ultimatum to say this thing is most important. It doesn't fit with multifaceted, subjective ideas that people can have. Third extension, why is our counterfactual significantly better for people in the pursuit of self-actualization? This is where CG will hammer it home. two impacts here. Number one, we are significantly lesser emotional burden because we don't go through the mental health of being in a relationship. We are more likely to also, number two, pursue what truly makes you happy. If relationship is not important for you, maybe not. Maybe you want a friend to talk to, go for it. Finding a family to give support structure, go for it. The best part here is there's different avenues that exist right now for people to find a balance and focus in their life. Look at the Warabel culture or the Honjok culture in South Korea, where people are doing traditionally communal activities alone. Like if they're traveling with a partner, they're doing it alone. Instead of, I don't know, doing so many things together that we usually do, you can do it alone. So there's more avenues for people to actually be alone. Why is this debate winning? Number one, it's consistent with readiness according to metric of time. That means if you don't want love right now, okay, can be alone. You want love later on? Okay, go for it. Number two, it's winning because of autonomy. Because optimal satisfaction is always very fluid, happiness. Maybe love is good for you right now, but at some point you feel love's not good for you, but you cannot opt out in their world. But in our world, because happiness is fluid, it's more, you're given more autonomy to decide when you can move and when you cannot go. Thirdly, we focus on our individuality and self-esteem, and this is truly important. In a world where you don't focus on emphasis on relationship, that's when you really explore what you truly want. Jobs, what activities truly give you joy? This is so important because individuality is pertaining towards your self-esteem and it's lifelong. If you don't build a relationship with yourself right now, you're always in a pit of not knowing whether or not you're truly satisfied or happy, regardless of how life actually turns out. Why does this weigh out is so important, even if you accept all of the benefits of opposition? Number one, in a world where you're socially conditioned to find different facets in being alone, you're more likely to find platonic friendships that give you the benefit of relationship. You're more likely to find insane emotional conversations with your family that gives you the benefit. So we achieve a large sum of the benefit at the same time. But at the same time, all the harms of relationship, the fact that it's ambiguous, the fact that number two, it's abusive and toxic. Number three, the fact that it doesn't fit with your ideals. Number four, the fact that standards and expectations. All of these problems are certain. We don't avoid that. So proud to stand in closing government.
Thanks for giving that speech. I invite the member of opposition to begin the case for closing opposition.
Okay, I can be heard and seen, right? POIs in chat, please. I'll try to take one before 5. Yeah. Starting my speech. Quite nervous. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm gonna do some urgent reframing here because I don't think government seems to understand what exactly is it media depiction and a realistic depiction that like O tries to push through, right? And I'm gonna give you more levels of nuances in how exactly would like the romanticization of relationships necessarily on my part. But let's focus on the alternative narratives that OG and CG tries to push through, right? Because they're essentially the same thing, right? OG tries to push the idea of hookup culture and transient relationships as a viable alternative, right? A few questions here. First, when your own PM comes up to you and tells us how like the harms of a shallow relationship that is caused by the culture you allege is on our side, I argue that like this, the harms that happen is like arguably worse on your on OG's own case when they tell us about like transient relationships and hookup culture, right? Because those are the individual circumstances where like you get people using you purely for your body. You get people not caring about boundaries and consent because of the fact that you carry no real social or emotional significance to them. That's the point at which like people only see you as a piece of meat in the panopticon that is like dating apps in general, right? So that's the point at which like people judge you on the most shallow basis, such as like wealth, such as like individual attractiveness that like you get on their side, right? But also OG comes in here with a very strong amount of internal tension in that case, right? They argue that people on our side is relationships or relationships sake. People will stay in relationships because they assume that it brings them happiness. But then they tell us that relationships are essentially transactional on our side based on like how individuals like what types of gifts you get from your partner, what types of things, what type of treatments you get from your partner. I argue that when you argue that our relationships are based on some level of reciprocity, i.e. when you base the idea of how valuable relationships are on like certain amounts of gift exchanges or words that they say to each other, that's the point at which you cannot claim the largest degree of the harms of abuse or whatever. Because that's the point at which when people in abusive situations realize that, oh, this relationship isn't as transactional as I want it to be. This is the point at which these relationships do not, the relationship isn't being reciprocated to the extent that I want it to be, right? But last thing, when they say that individuals can opt out of relationships and opt out of like larger happiness, and I think this news is closing case about being alone also, right? Like when you want to argue that forced marriages are symmetrical on both sides, that's also the point where you also agree that marriages have certain cultural, political, and economic ties that and reasons to exist, irregardless of the spectrum, meaning that marriage as a concept is still going to be glorified at the end goal as a natural consequence of events at the end of the day, which means that you cannot necessarily frame out marriage as something that society coerces you into, because that's just a natural way of how society works, right? CG comes in here and tells you that like there are society is one in which it's more okay to be alone and it's more okay not to find love, but merely asserts that, right? Because here's the thing, right? There's a societal emphasis for you to find a long-term relationship regardless, because a stable long-term relationship is at its best, it's always going to be better than being alone at your best, because you get a stable, healthy person to help create a good financial, emotional safety net that allows you a larger degree of social mobility, that allows you a larger degree of like financial, like, capital to spend. So ultimately, like, there is going to be a push towards long-term relationships, no matter if you like it or not, right? They argue, CJ's main counter narrative here is to just argue that, like, when people are more comfortable being alone and like you get like larger degrees of realistic depictions of relationship on their side, right? I have few things to contend with this, right? First, on an idea of minorities, right? They assert that adversity is not being depicted and the lives of minorities are not accurately reflected in media. I say, so what? People need to celebrate the best parts of, like, their own beliefs. But even if so, I think the media naturally loves the adversity and like an underdog narrative. So naturally, all of the charms that you want to say on your side about ugly people, about poor people, about sexual minorities, I think necessarily don't run, because the media loves to, like, show love in adversity. That's why Romeo and Juliet as a play has, like, been popular for so long, because it's love against the largest degree of adversity you can get from your whole family, right? And it argues about social convention and sexism and all that. I think that's just a fucking wash, because of the fact that, like, on your side, women are going to be treated as sexual objects whether they're in relationships or not, because on your side, queer people are going to be treated as monsters whether they're in relationships or not. But let's do some reframing, right? What exactly is the societal emphasis that leads societal emphasis in relationships? So I think, like, let's talk about it, right? Realistic depiction and diversity depiction. I think OO tries to explain it, but doesn't explain it to its fullest extent, right? Because OO tells you that romance is not about roses and castles, doesn't tell you what it's about. Romance is about reciprocity, about the emotion and the effort that individuals put into their relationship, and the effort, like, the individuals, like, put into the relationship, and, like, the emotional intimacy that you get from the relationship, right? And that's how people model their relationships after, and that's how people want to display their relationships after, right? Note that while, like, the entire government wants to center this on media, I want to bring in a new element of social media here, right? Because the entire thing about relationships goes is that people tend to share aspects of their relationship in order to glorify them. People share, I'll take it later. People share aspects of relationship that, like, be boast about it and say that, oh, I'm so happy and secure about these things, right? That means that there's a large diversity of representation, right? Because unless you can prove that ugly people never find love on your side, you cannot necessarily tell me that, like, there's no representation for ugly and, like, poor people finding love. But also in just that, like, again, media likes stories of adversity, right? What then that does is that is internalized by people to create a gold standard for relationships to be set, right? People have larger standards, which means that they hold their partners to a higher position. But hence, that also means two things, right? Number one, that people are more likely to communicate these needs and expectations to their partner because they necessarily want them to meet them. Relationship goals don't materialize out of nowhere. It comes of communication. It comes from the expectation, like, that you place on that, and telling them that the expectation basically exists. And B, I think that it's also about, like, even if you find your expectations not being met, you can always leave the relationship to find another, right? Because this person is not the one. You want to keep on going on to find the person that is most suited for you, that you feel safe and secure with, right? I don't agree with the narrative that the one doesn't exist, because necessarily there must be a person that exists as its state, like, that you can necessarily settle down for most of your life to and feel relatively secure about, right? So I don't understand why is it that's also the push, right? But let's talk about how individuals internalize, like get better, like, communication skills. It's just a simple fact that, like, when people grow up in these societies, they learn from the media around them, they learn from people around them about how, okay, I'll take your PR now.
Yes, you want to every single benefit of relationships. Where do you draw the line on romantic relationships?
Okay, yeah, that's what I'm going to go into now. Okay, so people model their own expectation of relationships based on two things, right? Number one, their own personal circumstance, and number two, the relationships that already exist around them. So meaning that you don't get that ridiculously high expectation on their side, because necessarily people have logical sense of thinking. They're not going to model themselves after some fucking superstar in China, right? Necessarily relationships will remain grounded, and that also means that their own happiness is essentially emphasized, right? As long as you feel comfortable in that relationship, that's the main thing that will get through from this message, right? Because how people judge successful relationships isn't about, like, whether or not how many diamonds you accumulate at the end of the day. It's about how safe and secure you feel at the end of the relationship, right? So that means that, like, given that there is a degree of democratization in depiction, that also means that people are here long-term to seek for long-term and stable relationships, right? What that gets is that individuals are more understanding and more willing to engage with each other about emotional needs, about like, trying to meet each other's emotional needs because they want each other to be the one. It also means that individuals are more invested in the long-term goals of the relationship, right? i.e. they want relationships to stay safe and secure, but as long as possible without jeopardizing it with lack of communication, with lack of, like, whatever it is that they want to talk about on their side, right? So on net positive, CO tells you why exactly the relationships are more likely to be successful on outside. Yeah.
Thanks, Speaker, for that speech. And with the government whip to conclude the debate from the government bench.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. POIs in chat. No preferred gender pronouns. If I don't see your POI, please turn on your camera at the 5th minute. Thank you. Without further delay, the biggest problem from CO is understanding of scale. Because if you realize all the criticism that extension has against gov material is that you will be pushed towards something anyway. Discrimination will happen anyway. Objectification will happen anyway. Marriage is a natural occurrence of human instinct. First of all, I'm not sure why all of these things are true, especially when Kuhn weighs out that even if to some extent you're objectified, you're discriminated, or external pressures exist, the fact of the matter is the key to the car in determining what a happy relationship will look like is now in your hands, and that in and of itself is a benefit. So even if there are other natural pushes, it's not going to be as strong as these social narratives. CO cannot come here and tell us that because these things will still exist, it's better to have this emphasis because this emphasis has some value that can create some benefits, especially when you heard so much of material from Kuhan telling you why A, through media, and B, through social and cultural norms, why this is extremely harmful. What are their responses to this? First of all, they don't directly engage other than saying that it will happen too without recognizing scale, which is a critical error to make in any reasonable debate. But secondly, and more importantly, is that they don't they tell you that we are going to bring in new elements, social media. First of all, opening opposition already extensively talked about social media, but we will get into that later. But bottom line is the argument still stays, which is all of these narrative or mechanisms of narrative have a unique goal that they want to reach. Media, profit. Society, conservatism and maintaining tradition. Social media, likes, comments and engagements. I'm unsure as to why just because you introduced a new element and talk about some successful examples of healthy relationships on social media that many people find to be popular, that not only this is A, accessible to everyone, but B, everyone can extrapolate what it means to be in a good relationship, how to modify your goals based on the small pictures or small engagements that you get from social media from people that you have no idea who they are and how they behave outside of this camera, especially when there's well-documented evidence that whatever happens in social media is a scam and is a sham. And nobody knows what's happening behind closed doors. So I don't think this is the metric in which you determine whether this can give you happiness. Second is that they talk about this vague idea of reciprocity, that in their world, in an emphasis of romantic relationships, you will create individuals that would want to return the gifts or reciprocate the love, the expressive love that you get from your partner. And when you reciprocate, your partner will feel appreciated. Therefore, you will have a meaningful and happy relationship. Not only this is extremely simplistic and one-dimensional, assuming that you can reciprocate to the same extent to your partner and your partner will appreciate it, and that is enough to have a successful relationship. B, again, this does not acknowledge all the material you hear from Kuhan, because the emphasis on on relationships is not only the emphasis that you should have it, it's also about how you should behave in these relationships. Now, I ask you, in any media portrayal, what is the extent in which reciprocity is treated as the main success or make or break deal in a relationship? Absolutely not. It's more about the huge things that a man does in order to make a woman happy. It's more about the woman realizing she's wrong and then begging for forgiveness from the man. Even in social conventions, it's always about the family of the man giving dowry to a woman. There's no reciprocity. If a woman becomes pregnant, she has to deal with it in this relationship and the man can leave. These are all instances in which the inequality is very strong, and more so in terms of other types of relationships like LGBT relationships, where reciprocity is not even equal, not even portrayed successfully to an extent that is realistic. I'm uncertain as to why this is going to be successful. So even if you believe reciprocity is an important element of relationship, I don't think CO showed you how reciprocity that is emphasized by these social conventions, even through social media, is one that is effective. Unless for them, it's like you buy a balloon, I posted it, then another guy buy a balloons and post it. Oh, reciprocal. I know what a good relationship will look like now. No. Lastly, is this idea of goals and expectations. Again, this is not clashing with Kuhan's material on how goals and expectations are formed in their world. In their world, even if in the best case, someone has a reasonable goal and reasonable expectation what they want from their partner, and they believe it is relatively attainable, and it is something that is portrayed well enough in the media, it's not as if these goals and expectations are not fluid. These goals and expectations may change according to your dynamic with your partner. The difference is, in your world, either one of two things will happen. Either A, this partner, because they don't fit the ridiculous goals and expectations that have been set through this narratives, they leave, or you let them go, or you change your goals and you change your expectations, which will only make you unhappy in this relationship, especially when you compare to all the benefits that of a relationship that you can get from all the alternatives that Kuhan told you: friends, family, dog, whatever, wanking, Hanju culture, so on and so forth. Before I move on, is there a POI from CO? 1, 2, 3. Oh. Okay, done. Okay, I'm moving next. Lastly, opening opposition. Two things opening opposition tells you. First is that discourse. Again, there's no indication of any reason why discourse in and of itself is good. It is not. You have to prove why there's some level of valuable discourse that can reach a conclusion that can make these individuals happy. Unfortunately, because of profit incentive, because of social conventions, it's impossible for this discourse to reach a level in which you can attain freedom. Look at what DLO said. You can just say no. What a ridiculous example. If a person is shooting you on the street with great power, what are you supposed to do? No. And the person will listen to you. If you're a woman and you say no, when your father asks you to get married, the father will say, oh yeah, I watched 500 Days of Summer too. I'm going to let you make your own choices. It's very unlikely that these types of discourses will result in the examples that they're talking about, especially when the incentive structures of all of these entities that build these narratives will not change, or has not given any incidences of change coming from CO. Bottom line is, why is our extension winning this debate? Firstly, in terms of the harms that we told you, it is one that is magnified to such an extent that it is impossible to overcome with a little bit of progress and discourse, especially when the incentives, this discourse and progress is not centering around the natural incentive structures of these institutions. Secondly, is the benefits that you can achieve when you are alone, especially when Kuhan highlighted specifically to a greater extent than opening about what it means to be alone, why it's more accessible to be alone, and why happiness is more accessible alone in a world where there's no emphasis. You can do all of these things in your world too, but because of the narrative that continuously exists and emphasize you that your version of being happy is wrong, it's more likely that you're unable to attain happiness because of these external pressures. While there are anomalies that can detach themselves, it's very unlikely that a vast majority can do so. The last thing is, all the benefits of the relationships that they're talking about is something that we can achieve to some extent with other individuals without this emphasis, compared to the harms that we can definitely and certainly remove. For those reasons, proud to propose.
Thanks, Speaker, for that speech. I invite the opposition whip to conclude the debate as a whole.
Audible?
Yeah.
Cool. POIs verbal, preferably after 5, preferably from opening, but if not closing, sure. I'm restarting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Romantic love is sacred and important. It's the sense of warmth that you get when you're at rock bottom. It's the shoulder for you to cry on in times of hardship. It's the sense of emotional intimacy unique to ourselves. But most importantly, these feelings are only obtained when the relationship is sustainable. That's what change will prove to you. First, OG, then CO, and then CG, then lastly on OO. First, OG. OG characterization here is problematic because under both sides of the house, people want to get into a romantic relationship anyways, because even without societal emphasis, you think a couple cuddling or sharing a moment together generally means there's a natural one for you to opt into a romantic relationship. But almost everyone, the unique distinction is that this emphasis provides you the information and acts as a guideline for individuals to navigate a romantic relationship. This is the demonizing toxic abusive trait that partners generally want to avoid. How to sustain a romantic relationship when you're inexperienced. When you set up an inexpensive date night, for example, example, because know that in the absence of that emphasis, people idealize romantic relationships, but have no actual means of opting into romantic relationship. We make relationships much more accessible when people know how to date or how to love correctly. Because OG concedes that there are going to be people that want to opt into relationship under their side of the house. The problem is that they don't know how to navigate it, and that relationship becomes a lot more unsustainable and will eventually lead to a breakup, a harm that breaks individuals down emotionally and mentally under OG. But I also just want to note that the comparative of other relationships the individual can opt into is problematic on OG also. Because obviously under both sides, you can always have friends in other forms of platonic circles and anyways. The problem is that platonic relationships are a lot more unsustainable because your friends will always be there for you. Your colleagues barely interact with you. Your college circles eventually fade out. Your family members might have their own lives. All of this means that OG's comparative has long-term harm when you end up all alone with most of your emotions bottled out and without much meaning in life anyways. Whereas romantic relationships are uniquely long-term. They emphasize on feelings of intimacy and affection, emotional dependency on one another, the reciprocation of love and care and such that most people would generally want when they become old and frail. They want a hand to hold them when no one else is willing to. That's the unique expression coming from ZR. But then I also just want to note then that romantic expression doesn't have to always be expensive. Because people opt into romantic relationship not because they expect expensive cards and candlelit dinner, because frankly that's a bit toxic. They care about the gesture it presents, the kiss on the bench, the scarf you bought for the Valentine's Day, the late night disco calls talking about your problem. Because that emphasis is not just expensive restaurant dinners, but also just know that DPM had an extension on toxic relationship being hard to opt out. Engage on this in the most charitable manner possible. Because the reason people cannot opt out of toxic relationship was precisely the reason OG stated. Because the lack of emphasis means that people don't know how to draw boundaries, don't know how to identify red flags, don't know how to resort to in times of abuse. Because people know so little about the complexities of this relationship. The way we win out on OG on this is simple. Because this is when you have the media portraying how a relationship goes. How does being with the one, how does being with D1 look like? And how should we feel in a romantic relationship? When romantic relationships are destigmatized, so parents are more comfortable talking about the intricacies of these sorts of romantic relationship. That is at the point in time where you're able to see whether or not the relationship that you're in is toxic or actually romantic. Because in extreme cases of abuse and other forms of manipulative behavior, it doesn't conform to the mainstream view of what romantic relationships are. And thus it is a lot easier for you to opt out when there's a counter narrative by the media that prevents you from internalizing bad abusive behaviors by your partner by calling it what it is: abuse, toxicity, red flags. And it's precisely because there's an emphasis on romantic relationship that you know the emotional support structures that exist that you can rely on for help. But lastly, that on OG terms of single mother, the reason I'm not sure is why it's important is because single mothers under your side of the house rarely get any sort of help anyways, because understand that even if you co-parent, it's likely because you do it out of love for the mother, for example, or you do it out of some degree of love. So under that, it's likely going to be symmetrical. But also just understand this whole idea about single mother is just like not the biggest thing to take into account in this debate. I think we can all agree that that's something that's frankly boxed out by CG themselves as well. Because CG then was correct in saying that this debate wasn't about mothers and sons that DPM would deposit. But the arguments are also problematic because in the absence of that emphasis, prejudice are entrenched within society, as homophobia and transphobia and sexism are still going to be prevalent within society. But I'll go as far as to say that even if this takes place in a socially regressive and conservative state, all of the benefits that children gave on information access to navigate love is going to materialize independent of the cultural context that CG provides. Which means that all of the benefits at the end of the day on our side are still likely going to stand. So they provide no solution at all because the sexist, misogynistic narrative that are so proudly against, good luck solving that under your side. But I also just want to go and flip on the idea about social norms, because I'll argue that in most places where there's an emphasis on romantic relationship, it likely means that society is going to happen in society that are a lot more liberal and feminist, because the prerequisite to there being emphasis by the media is that the concept of the prerequisite for there to like be emphasis by the media on the idea of romantic relationship is the concept of like romantic relationship being destigmatized in the first place. So the narratives aren't going to be sexist or misogynistic, especially in society where such concepts are actively shunned by society already. But also just know that the capitalism extension doesn't work here, because there's unlikely going to be one that portrays really high social standards. Because something like love transcends things like race or skin color, which means that in order for it to gain the most amount of public attention and support, is to be as representative as possible within your ads and within your campaigns. Because everyone can relate and want to resonate with the concept of love, independent of who you are when it
independent of what religion or what race you are. But also just know that this is still completely derivative for CG. Because originally the main bulk of the work about how pressure is bad, Gohan says the word capitalism and says the extension. But I just want to read the fucking info slide, please, because the media doesn't glorify romantic relationship, but the pursuing a romantic relationship, which is exactly what inspires individuals to want to continue pursuing D1. Wait, before that, POI. Opening.
Yeah, whether the relationship is sustainable or not, it's still the choice of the individual. Why do you still need to emphasize?
Under your side of the house, there's also likely going to be coercive because the moment that you see someone cuddling on the street, the moment that you see people kissing on the bench, that is likely going to make you feel envious. It makes you feel jealous, which means that independent of whether or not there's a media narrative, there's already a natural incentive for you to want to opt into those relationships anyways. I don't get the point of that POI. But also, just like on the idea about inspiring individuals to want to pursue D1 despite the adversity surrounding them, because I'm confident that there's a happy ending at the end of the day. So individuals are going to put in more effort to opt into a relationship without feeling like a complete failure. But moving on to wit, don't play with scale because there's zero response to Cheng's idea on this information being more accessible. The response was lazy. It's that social media are scam and untrue because people on social media generally value authenticity. So the most likes and the most engagement are those that show relationship in the most realistic way possible. Conflicts and how to resolve them, the red and green flags within a relationship, the expectation and feelings of being in a romantic relationship. Because in absence of the emphasis, your own individual expectations are going to be high. Because there's no counter value narrative to set those expectations straight. This is a missing link in OO. We should provide an analysis about why that discourse is likely going to be the most informative and the most digestible way possible. But it's very damn unfortunate that race comparative doesn't exist because they never require things like social norms or prejudice can be argued under that side of the house. So subconsciously, people are still going to be the same under CO anyways. The reason we win over OO, we provide you the reasons why these relationships are likely going to be more sustainable. So this means that in order for all the benefits that OO talked about, it comes and our analysis came in a clean fire because we actually show you how to maintain and sustain that relationship to oppose.
Thank the speaker for that speech and all the speakers for a fine debate. Speakers can head back into the main room while the panel deliberates.